All right. Welcome everyone to our webinar on Complete Streets 101. Today we've got Heather Shady, who is uh, the Senior Transportation Planner at the Active Transportation Alliance, and then myself, Maggie Mullen. And then Anthony Corso is our special guest from the City of Peoria. He's their Chief Innovation Officer. And just a little background on who we are. We're the Active Transportation Alliance, and we're a nonprofit advocating for walking, biking, and public transit uh, in Chicago, but we're also doing some work in Peoria and in Carbondale area. So this webinar is actually open to everyone from the entire state and beyond, actually. I believe there's someone from some out-of-state folks too on the call. So today we're going to briefly go over what are complete streets, and Heather is going to go over some myth busting of some common misconceptions, either government officials, staff, or community members have about what a complete streets policy means. We'll go into steps on how to actually get a policy passed, both at a municipal level, and then what can advocates do in their community. Anthony's going to be speaking about his experience in Peoria, getting a complete streets policy passed and the steps they took to make that happen and what's been the result since then. And then for those of you who are really interested in digging into the details of what is in a complete streets policy, we'll go into depth into the 10 elements of what makes up a policy. We'll share some resources, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. And if you do have to jump off at any time, it's okay, because we're recording this webinar and we'll put it on YouTube afterwards. So you can watch it again. You can share it with others. So what are complete streets? They are streets that can be traveled safely across, upon, and alongside by all users of the roadway. So it's not only a street for cars, but it's a place where people walking, biking, and taking transit also feel safe. And uh, it emphasizes protecting the most vulnerable users. So here's an example. We often like to show this photo, and maybe some of you have seen this before, of what is common throughout our state. A very car-centric street, and if any of you can, if you're watching the webinar and can see the presentation, you can see there's a lonely pedestrian in the middle of the street there, and clearly he's trying to get across the street, and it's not a safe situation for him. However, what we do like to see, that you can see this street is designed for all road users. It has a crosswalk, it has a pedestrian island, so a person could easily go from one side of the street to the other. It has a bike lane, and it has turning lanes for the cars. So it is, in this case, it's accommodating everyone to be able to safely move about this street. And what exactly is a policy? So it is a change in your approach for design. It's considering all users, so it's not thinking just about people driving, it's thinking about people walking, biking, and accessing transit. So it's all users and all modes. However, the policy is context sensitive. It doesn't make sense necessarily to have all of these accommodations on every road, depending on the speed of the vehicles traveling on that road, the size of the road, and we'll talk more about what this means a little later on. And what can a policy help you achieve? It is it'll help you, your community, identify key users of the road. So people walking, biking, taking transit, as well as vulnerable users, so you can make more equitable decisions. And it does help you look at the context. Where should exceptions be allowed? Maybe in certain situations it doesn't make sense to have people walking or people driving in certain types of streets. The policy will look at how projects are approved and kind of help you create a system for that, and also funding and prioritizing these types of projects that involve accommodations for walking and biking. And then finally, it can help you keep track of uh, over time what's happening in your community and are complete streets, these concepts actually being implemented on the ground. And then finally, having a policy, we're finding more and more that it can help bring in money to your community. When you have a complete streets policy, you'll be more competitive for many different types of grants. So, for example, surface transportation program funding, it's federal funding that is awarded to local MPOs, and uh, in many cases, uh, these MPOs are now requiring complete streets policies, or at least elements of complete streets, or not necessarily requiring, but awarding points for either a policy or elements of complete streets. So Tri-County Regional Planning Commission, for example, uh, is doing this, and that is Peoria County, Woodford County, Tazewell County, and they award uh, a good chunk, around 10 points for out of 100 for walking and biking multimodal elements in a project. And the Chicago Metropolitan Planning Agency, CMAP, which is the Chicagoland region MPO, through their council of mayors, they award surface transportation programs. And now we're seeing more and more counties here, like Lake County, McHenry County, DuPage County, the south suburban counties, prioritizing projects that are multimodal, that account for all road users. Um, and and as a result, we're seeing more policies actually being developed in some of these counties. So uh, in addition to this, Illinois Department of Transportation, IDOT, when their complete streets, when our state complete streets policy is triggered, they do look for projects or communities that have complete streets policies, um, or walking and biking plans, and your project will more likely then include some type of walking and biking accommodation. So when are complete streets activated? It's when new construction um, is occurring, so when a new road is being built, and it's also reconstruction. So it could be the road is being resurfaced, there's some utility work. So these are all times when complete streets, when a policy is triggered and when there's an opportunity to make some changes on the road. And because there's already construction going on, it's a lot less expensive to create additional accommodations for people walking and biking. And then just to look at where are complete streets policies, both in the Chicagoland region and in the state. So complete streets, nationally, there are more than 1,500 of these policies, and within Illinois, we know of at least 50, and there could be more. This map here, if you're watching online, it is a map of the Chicagoland region, so 7 counties around Chicago, and there are several policies here, and there are a few communities in green that those are policies that are currently in progress. So we've got about 7 or so, or perhaps more, that are in progress. Policies can be resolutions, they can be ordinances, they can be executive orders. So it depends on what your community is looking for. Between resolutions and I would say probably resolutions are the most common, but ordinances are more um, effective, uh, are stronger. You could say they're more binding. Yes, thanks, Jeff. um, and resolutions are less so. Uh, so this map is a look at complete streets policies. Uh, within Illinois, and this map is from the National Complete Streets Coalition. And if you Google National Complete Streets Coalition, you can uh, check out the map of policies, and these are policies that they're aware of. So it's possible that some policies are missing, but again, that we know of at least 50 uh, around the state. So myth busting, I'm going to hand it over to Heather. Yeah, we're going to try on her headset to see if it works. So one sec.
Can you hear me? Okay, great. All right, so thank you, Maggie, very much. We thought we'd take a little time to go over some myth-busting slides. And just for context on these slides, Maggie and I do lots of presentations to city and village staff members, elected officials, people who are curious about complete streets but often think it may be expensive or require a lot of facilities and infrastructure that they may not have the budget for. So we use these slides to kind of make the case that complete streets isn't going to break the budget and doesn't necessarily require a city to do specific things on every single street. So we'll go through these slides, and again, we'll be sharing this presentation with you. Maggie will send it out once we're complete. So we encourage you to use these in your work and your advocacy and trying to get more complete streets policies passed. Okay, so number one is do complete streets mean putting bike lanes and sidewalks on every single street? That is incorrect. So no complete streets policy, having a complete streets policy does not mean you need to put a bike lane or a sidewalk on every single street in your community. What the policy means is that when a project is being considered by a municipality or another agency that has its own complete streets policy, they need to consider what kinds of facilities are appropriate for the context of that road and see if it can fit within their budgetary constraints for that project. We'll get more into the details on this later in this presentation when we talk about what the specific 10 elements of a complete streets policy are. So you can see some other examples of what complete streets means in communities. So, you know, complete streets, again, doesn't just mean bike lanes or sidewalks. There can be smaller items that are considered as a part of your complete streets policy when you're touching a roadway. For example, just striping new crosswalks when you're resurfacing a road could be considered complete streets. In other cases, if you're in a very rural community, one that doesn't necessarily have sidewalks or the community doesn't want them, a complete street can often be something like a paved shoulder or even just a very low volume road with no curb and gutter. So again, we'll talk about context sensitivity later, but what complete streets policies can mean for a community is that you really are thinking about what is the context of the road, what is the context of the land surrounding it, who's going to these places, what kinds of modes are expected to be present, and how can we best accommodate them and also balance the needs of all the users on that street. Okay, the next myth we'd like to bust is active transportation facilities add large costs to roadway projects. Surprise, we think this is false. So again, there are, yes, active transportation facilities can add large costs to a roadway project if it's not a part of the scope of work. So for example, if you're going to resurface a street and decide to add a sidewalk to it that requires a ton of right-of-way acquisition, yes, of course, that will add a big cost to your project. But if you are resurfacing the street and need to do some simple pavement markings, no, that won't. So it really depends on the type of project and the scope of project. And complete streets having a policy won't require you to do these out of scope, out of budget, expensive projects. Again, what it's asking the community and the roadway designers and elected officials to do is figure out how to incorporate complete streets within a reasonable scope of that project. So you can see for an example here of a right-sizing project on a road. Um, this is just a simple change in striping. The picture on the left is the before, which is a 4-lane street, two ways in each direction, or 2 lanes in each direction. On the right side, the road has been the space on the road has been reallocated to include a center left turn lane and 2 bike lanes. Here, again, the project would not have been very expensive. The striping doesn't cost a lot. There would be some additional study needed just to make sure that it's right for this case. So the next myth we've heard is active transportation facilities, or there's no need for active transportation facilities because everybody drives. Can we click next? Sorry, Maggie's multitasking here. So the answer to this one again is false. So I think that there's often a misconception in communities that people, that more people or everybody has access to a car. This isn't true. In fact, 30% of people in the United States either 50% of people, 30% of people in the United States don't drive, either because they don't have a license, they're too young to drive, maybe if they've aged out of driving, or they're unable to because of a disability, or they simply can't afford a car. So within every single community, there's a subset of folks who don't have access to a car, aren't able to get to the places they need to, and need an alternative. Therefore, it's important for everybody who's working on roadway projects to consider these users and figure out who they are, where they're going, what they're trying to reach, and make sure that there are safe, comfortable accommodations provided for them. So you can see examples of different people here. In some cases, we call folks non-choice users, like the person up in the right corner riding his bike along what we would not consider a shoulder. So again, I'm sure you see these people in your communities as you're making your way around town, and it's important to make sure that projects serve their needs as well. The fourth myth we have is that complete streets mean reconstructing all of our roadways right now. Again, this isn't true. Complete streets mean looking for opportunities to make sure that you are addressing your goals, priorities, and objectives through every project you undertake. So it can be something as simple as crosswalk striping or marking a bike lane that you've already had in the plans when you're resurfacing a street. Or if you do have an opportunity for larger capital funds that can help you reconstruct a street, then take that opportunity to do something really big and impactful that you've had a plan for, or as a goal of your residents and stakeholders. So with that, Maggie and I thought we'd take a quick moment to talk about steps to passing a policy. Again, later in the presentation, we'll talk about what the specific elements are within a policy, but this is a higher level, how do you get things going and done in your community. So I'll start with municipal staff members. I know we have a few people from municipalities on this call. So we've seen it done in a couple of ways. The first way is you write a draft policy and present it to the people that need to make the decision on it and try to get it done. Or the second path is to form a committee that together works on a draft policy. Either way, we recommend that you, as the champion of a complete streets policy within your jurisdiction, work with the people who are tasked with policy implementation to make sure they understand what the policy is, that they're comfortable with the language, and that they've given input on it, so that when it comes time to start implementing it, they're all okay with it, understand it, and use it as a matter of protocol. So, excuse me. So we, the people that could be involved in policy development along with you could include people from public works, engineering, planning, even emergency services, and of course elected officials. Again, they all play a role in designing, building, constructing projects, and and you want to make sure that they are as comfortable with the policy as you are, so it is implemented in the future. The other thing we'll note is once you have a draft policy put together that's been vetted by your partners and colleagues, you'd also want to determine who needs to approve the policy within the structure of your government. In some cases, this will be the village manager. In other cases, you may need to present to transportation or public works committees, and typically also the board or aldermen will need to approve it as well. So again, we want you to feel comfortable taking these slides that we've presented today and using them in your work. So as you are trying to make the case to whomever needs to decide this policy, please borrow from us and use our learnings.
And Heather has actually presented the myth busting to several communities as a way to make the case for complete streets. And one other thing to know, we do have a model draft policy that you could start from. I'll send out links to everyone later today, and you can also find it on our website, which I'll show you a link at the end of this presentation. So we have a model policy. You can start from there and make any edits you want to it. It's sometimes nice to have a starting place. You can feel free to use any of the language you want. And we also have a website, atpolicy.org, with many examples. So you could pull up an example community, check out their complete streets policy, and start editing from there. You might also look to see who do your neighboring municipalities, do they have any complete streets policies as a nearby local example to start from. So for advocates on the call, what can you do? So first is finding out, does your community have a complete streets policy? So you can go to smartgrowthamerica.org and look up their complete streets map to see if your community pops up on their map. It's possible that they don't have your community on their map and you do have a complete streets policy, but it's a good place to start. We also have a Google Excel sheet, a shared document that anyone can get into, and we're trying to do an inventory of all complete streets policies within the state. So you can go to activetrans.org/bikewalkeverytown, and if you scroll down in the resources, you can check that Excel sheet to see if your community is listed as having a complete streets policy, and if we have a link, there will be a link there. So those are two places to check to find out first, do you have a policy? If you find out you don't have a policy, or you just can't find it through your research, I'd recommend the first step would be getting in touch with your local municipal staff. So try to contact a local planner, for example, and see if there is interest. Get the insight from them. Have they tried in the past? Is it something that they're considering in the future? If it is something that they are open to, you can share you can share resources with them. You can share the model draft policy. You can share some other links that we'll share again with you at the end of the webinar, and be a resource for them, help them out. And then in many cases we've heard planners or staff at a municipality, it helps if they know that there's community support for walking and biking. So if you are interested and willing, we recommend putting together some type of campaign, an advocacy campaign, to build support for walking and biking. And you could target your campaign on adopting a complete streets policy to let your elected officials know that this is an important policy that community members want. And at activetrans.org/bikewalkeverytown, again, we have a lot of resources on how to develop a campaign, and we have a 6-step process on how you can create an effective messaging and the steps you need to take to get the right people on board. So From here, I would like to turn the webinar over to Anthony. So Anthony is from the City of Peoria, um, and I want to make sure I may have muted Anthony. Let's see, where are you, Anthony? 309. More effectively. So Anthony is their Chief Innovation Officer. So Anthony, can we hear you?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes, yes. Awesome.
Awesome.
So, yay, thank you. Apologies for the issues.
No worries.
So I was just telling them about you, but Anthony, if you can kind of share your experience with everyone on on just the process Peoria went through to implement or to approve and pass the Complete Streets policy back in 2015, I believe, and what the experience has been since then.
Sure. And I may go overboard on the context, but this started long before me, so
yes, that's
I'll
okay.
give a little bit of background, and then happy to follow up with folks after the webinar as well if they have more questions. But really, this stems from kind of a whole conversation that started here, like in so many communities our size, small to medium-sized cities. Around 115,000 people is our population. In the 90s and 2000s, we were really looking at kind of rebuilding civic and cultural amenities in our downtown and urban core because of the pretty dramatic suburbanization of the city at large, but certainly the downtown that happened in the latter half of the 20th century. And in the early 2000s, we actually had a mayor very interested in, and after being introduced to kind of new urbanism and traditional development conversations on kind of looking at those approaches to kind of bring back the historic walkable urban core of the city. And so one of the offshoots of that was kind of a cross-sector effort to develop essentially a new urbanist plan, so called the Heart of Peoria plan, and that work started in the early 2000s, I think with kind of meetings, public meetings and charrettes happening in 2003, 2004, maybe even a little bit before that. But ultimately, in 2007, form-based code was developed out of the Heart of Peoria plan, and some of these kind of best practices, as we were starting, like so many other communities, to start to reinvest in our downtown, in our warehouse district, these were seen as kind of fundamental considerations to try to make that environment more friendly. So pedestrian friendly was I think the common term. There wasn't a complete streets kind of branded tagline back then, and essentially it's kind of weaved its way through different iterations over time, and finally in about 2015, actually, and ultimately in October of 2015, the city Public Works Department brought forward a complete streets ordinance to kind of codify the idea of looking at and considering all users and appropriate facilities when we were designing or doing major retrofits of our streetscapes in the city. And not too long after that, there was an effort to flesh out a bicycle master plan to kind of weave into that larger conversation. So we actually had some logic models and some clear connections that we were looking at, and these were things that we would work to try to implement over time. So at the same time, we had been working, and actually my team, the innovation team here at the city, had been working with our partners in public works and community development, and those even folks outside of the city around and community members around a solution to our combined sewer overflow issue. And the primary approach was to look at retrofitting our public rights-of-way, so essentially our streetscapes in the older part of the city. And what ended up happening as there was some momentum around complete streets, it was part and parcel of the planning for the city to do actually a green infrastructure approach, so to actually start integrating green infrastructure, green stormwater infrastructure into our streetscapes. And so at that time, back in 2015, we actually developed the concept of a network of complete green streets. Now you'll actually hear, those of you who are kind of been involved and are following policy and evolution of complete streets, it's largely identified now as, green stormwater infrastructure is a component of a true complete street, but it's not always part of it, and it's not always part of the conversation. So in 2017, within a year and a half or so of when we passed our ordinance, we're starting to kind of operationalize things. We actually invited the National Complete Streets Coalition here to Peoria to walk through, to do a workshop with our city staff, to do some public education and workshopping with residents, and also bring in, we rely pretty heavily, like most communities, on design consultants to actually do a lot of the design work for our streets. And so we brought National Complete Streets Coalition in, had them do kind of something they had already been doing for other communities, an evaluation of our policy, of our ordinance. Said it actually was measured up really well, had checked all the key boxes. But one of the reasons that we invited them in is because one of the challenges after having the ordinance was really operationalizing it and developing a consistent approach, which I think is a common challenge. And then the other one, which I think a lot of communities have challenges with, and I've heard this over the last few years as well, is that we're certainly able to collect data when we're doing a road reconstruction project or a major retrofit, whether it's resurfacing or something else, or even going in and doing some restriping, capturing data. We don't always have the resources to kind of analyze that data and kind of inform and help evolve our policy, if you will. And that's one of the things that Complete Streets policies and the National Complete Streets Coalition really pushes for, is to kind of, as you learn, as you get more context-sensitive approaches within your community, how can you evolve that? How can you improve that over time? And so we had a great workshop back then. That really turned into a regional conversation because Peoria is essentially the larger city in the center of a metropolitan statistical area, and it's in our best interest for all of the communities around us to kind of be thinking about and utilizing Complete Streets approach, because we're using the same. We have the same Department of Transportation. We have the same design engineers. We have the same community at large, and so the goal was really to kind of expand that. Working with our MPO, Tri-County Regional Planning Commission, they pulled together kind of a regional workshop, building on some of that National Complete Streets Coalition work, building on the city's experience with Complete Streets Ordinance, and some other conversations around some of the work of many of you have probably heard of strong towns and others, to try to kind of introduce ways that kind of at a high level with large capital projects you can implement this, but also kind of on the tactical urbanism side. And so I think there's a few slides in here that were added to the deck. They're actually probably the reverse of how I should have had them laid out with you guys. But so this slide here is the first kind of prototype or pilot of a complete green streets pilot project. And so this was essentially 4 lanes, at least 3 lanes in one. It was a one-way street running through the end of our warehouse district, and it is in our combined sewer area. And so it was a way to kind of demonstrate and test all the different aspects of implementing a green street, a complete green street, while testing out our strategies for green infrastructure for the combined sewer solution. And so this is a project that was completed in, I believe, October of 2017. We did 2 blocks at the edge of our warehouse district where we essentially right-sized it. We converted it back to 2A. We added bicycle facilities, corner bulb outs, pretty dramatically reduced the crossing distance for pedestrians, and did a number of kind of enhancements at the pedestrian scale. And ended up, instead of a traditional ribbon cutting for a project like this, we actually ended up doing a street festival, and within about an hour and a half of the start of that, had about 1,500 residents come through from all over the city. So it also served as a non-traditional ribbon cutting, but a way to reintroduce people from all over the community to a historically disinvested portion of the city, while learning about some of the benefits and experiencing some of the benefits of a complete street. So go ahead and go to the next slide, if you would. This actually happened a little before the one I just mentioned. I think sometime around 2010 or 2011, we received a federal Tiger II grant to do some significant infrastructure work, public right-of-way work within our warehouse district. Again, a lot of very wide streets that served a lot of truck traffic, very pedestrian unfriendly, and so went through a significant portion of the warehouse district of the city and added significant pedestrian enhancements and bicycle facilities. And you'll see sidewalk expansions. You'll see this is one of the roundabouts that was part of that work. But that really, I think, was probably the first large-scale embodiment of the evolution of these conversations that had happened for more than a decade before. So go ahead and hop to the next slide. This is right near my house. This is another example. There's actually some hardscape work where there was some right sizing done and a turn lane taken out in front of residential properties. But another thing that was added later as we kind of matured around kind of both the impact on travel speeds of vertical elements and other elements to protect pedestrians, but also getting the neighborhoods engaged and providing public art. So this is kind of a two-step process here that you're seeing. Was one, there were some essentially some bulb outs and reducing crossing distances and moving of right turn lanes where the number one kind of conflict with pedestrians was taking place, but also adding some public art and some more tactical approaches like these low-cost planters that went in to the neighborhood. And these are things that we're seeing, especially because we have large capital complete reconstruction projects are fewer and farther between. And so in the interim, what are the more incremental steps we can do to enhance the streetscape? So this is just one example of where some planters have been implemented, some local artists got involved, and some other things to try to really enhance the street that was part of almost a two-phase complete streets retrofit of this intersection and some nearby streets. And so with that, that's kind of a few examples. What I will say again is that one of the great things, and actually one of the reasons that I'm here talking to you today, is that our practice with this continues to evolve. We're getting better and better at kind of looking at how we can kind of operationalize and implement complete streets policies throughout the city, not just in the urban core. But now we're actually working with Heather and Maggie on a larger project to essentially create a design manual that captures all of the things that we've learned over time, all the processes that we've developed, and builds on our ordinance so that we've got essentially a book that we can use with our consultants, with our design engineers, better tell the story, better coordinate those efforts moving forward. So hopefully we'll have more success.
All right,
and at that, I'll kind of hand it back.
Yeah, thanks so much, Anthony. Appreciate hearing your perspective from the City of Peoria. And I wanted to, before we dig into the 10 elements of a complete streets policy, I did want to open it up to all of you who are on the call. If any of you had any questions for Anthony and how things evolved in Peoria. Unfortunately, I cannot just unmute everyone. But if you are on the watching the webinar online, you can add a comment to the comment box. So we'll give it 5 seconds. If no one has any questions, we'll continue on, and we'll also open it up to questions at the end of the webinar. Oh yeah, yes, thank you, Jeff. That's what I meant to tell everyone. So *6 can unmute you. So if you do have questions, and if you're currently muted on your phone or online, you can hit *6. And I do see some messages being typed.
I do have one question for Anthony. This is
Yeah.
Diddy Blythe in Parkwood. You were mentioning street art. Did you actually paint some of the walks with street art? Was that distracting? Was it pleasing? Did everybody love it? Or did you not even, is that something you did not do?
Yeah, so it's funny you asked that because we were very close to submitting a project for the Asphalt Art Initiative that Bloomberg put out.
Yes, I was too, and I didn't get there in time, Anthony.
Yeah, we have done a pilot project, if you will. It was actually, I think, done with tempera paint and a street, like a kind of a neighborhood intersection. It was actually one of our arterials with a relatively low traffic count, where that was done as part of a community corridor revitalization project kickoff. Most of the kind of the artwork that's been done, I think in the image you saw some planters that have been painted by a neighborhood artist. We've had art students come out and do some work on some of the bulb outs and other things related to the CSO, where they did kind of stormwater related art. So they did artworks and messages related to that around the storm inlet.
But you didn't actually put it on the asphalt.
Correct. So we haven't taken it out. We've done different things with the crosswalks beyond just Continental, but we have not gone to. And I think even what we were looking at and several of the projects we're exploring now have traditional Continental style crosswalks with art kind of integrated beside them, essentially, where you might have curb extensions where you're not actually reconstructing the curb and moving the curb line. You're doing soft hit delineators and paint to kind of right size or do a road diet or remove a turn lane, for example. Those are the kinds of things we're looking at where you would be painting on the asphalt itself, but not necessarily the primary driving lanes.
We're a previous art colony, and we have at least 11 to 12 to 13 famous artists that are deceased now. But we were thinking of designing crosswalks, highlighting each one of them, and then supplying at the library a map and an educational tour. And I just wanted to know, I don't want that artwork to cause a traffic accident when you're trying to cross the intersection looking at the crosswalk, and I wanted to know if you had any experience with that.
No, I think we're on the cusp of doing that. I think there's a whole slew of communities that have endeavored into this at different scales. But I will say that in talking to the folks that have to maintain all this stuff, there is some benefit and some logic, kind of doing art adjacent to within that intersection, maybe not on the primary drive surfaces, where there has been, at least from what I've heard, some concern raised about how it might impact the grip of the asphalt as you're going through, or I know there was some conversation or some chatter around distraction, but I don't know that there's a lot of data to back that up.
I would be more concerned with distraction than the grip of the asphalt. I mean, running into a flagpole, or another pedestrian is more serious than a slight slip on the,
Yeah, I think at that scale, at intersections, the general perception is that it actually, the impact may be more, that you're paying more attention at that intersection rather than less, because you're typically slowing down to observe. Similar impact to when you have a lot of people on the street, or you have a lot of street trees, or you have other things, vertical elements moving things, you tend to be paying then more attention as opposed to less. We all know, we probably all have those 5-lane, residential roads within our community with maybe very few trees and very few pedestrians and very few, changes in color. Those tend to be where the speed is an issue and where more of the impactful accidents happen.
Yeah, thank you for letting me take your time. Thank you.
Yep.
Anthony, we have a couple other questions that were typed in. One is we can maybe cover this really briefly, but what are the best state funding sources for complete streets policies, bike plans, etc.? And just on our end, we do have, I'll send this out also, but we have a spreadsheet of different funding opportunities that are ideal for walking and biking projects that you can look through. And Anthony, did you have any specific sources that you like to go to?
No, and I think actually some of that's becoming more mature now, especially with the recent kind of state funding that, in
Right.
fact, you guys were involved in,
Yeah. So,
indirectly.
so
For us,
in,
most of the work, the planning around the ordinances and other things were, came out of city funding, the bicycle planning. I can't remember if there was some grant funding associated with that or not, but I believe the majority of the work was, just part of the city's operations. I saw another question about so I might defer to you guys in terms of additional sources, and I know sources that exist now that maybe even didn't exist back when we first started doing this work.
Yeah,
But
I'll just add one for those who are in the Chicago area and part of the CMAP region. CMAP's LTA program is a really good resource for funding bicycle and pedestrian plans. So if you're looking for, at least a subsidized plan where you're not paying your out of the city budget entirely for it, CMAP, you can apply to CMAP's process. I think their call for projects is usually in May or June every year, so you have a few months to think about it. You could also fold in a complete streets policy into your ask for CMAP, and I would recommend doing that with any kind of bicycle and pedestrian plan consulting project, because the policy will be a smaller line item in your budget and doesn't necessarily need a full RFP or RFQ. So asking a consultant to do that for you as a part of an existing project you're working on is a good way to get it done.
yeah, this is Anthony again, and I do know that, and I couldn't tell you where the funding sources were from, but our MPO for us, the Tri-County Regional Planning Commission, has had opportunities for funding through state and federal funds before to kind of, small amounts of funding to study something or to move something forward around complete streets or related transportation topics. But the focus on that is more recent for us, at least.
all right, thanks. And next question is, did you have to deal, Anthony, with school districts as you were, I guess, creating your policy or implementing it, and how was that process?
That's a great question. So a lot of the conversation and probably much of the earlier outreach happened even before my time here. I think since it's been implemented, there's obviously kind of hopefully a benefit, especially to kind of neighborhood schools, as these kinds of projects are rolled out across the city, or things are changed with a resurfacing project or a restriping project. We've had conversations, maybe some one-off projects here and there about safe routes to school with different partners inside and outside the city that have resulted in some additional crosswalk work, some additional stop signs, some additional things like that. So there's been some collaboration with the schools around that. I think this probably making it a formal ordinance and a formal policy kind of strengthened that relationship a little bit. There are sometimes perverse impacts. If you make a street safer, sometimes school districts don't get funding for busing for certain things, and I know that's come up here and elsewhere before. So I think working with school districts as much as possible is important, so when they understand the overall benefit, and you can be as coordinated strategically as possible around the impacts on the neighborhood and the quality of life.
Okay, thanks. And last question here is, someone was asking what's a policy versus a plan versus a resolution versus an ordinance. And sorry, we were probably confusing some of you with throwing out all those terms. So a complete streets policy is different than a plan. So a complete streets policy is can be a resolution or an ordinance. Resolution is non-binding, an ordinance is binding. A plan is something separate, which it's really great when communities have both a complete streets policy and a active transportation plan. And you might hear the term bicycle plan, pedestrian plan, or a combined bicycle pedestrian plan, and that is laying out where does, and it's like through community input, where should the crosswalks go, where should the bike lanes go, are there any trails that need to be connected. So it's laying out a plan of what streets should have which types of treatments. So hopefully that clears some things up in case any of you were also having that question. Does anyone, we have about 5 more minutes left with Anthony, and Heather and I can stay on the line we'll go over the 10 elements for those of you who can also stay on, but again, we're recording this so you can listen to this later. But does anyone have any other quick questions for Anthony?
I have one. It's James. One of the things that in consideration making a complete streets and biking is when they do a study, interactions between cars and bikes, that slows down traffic and things like that. But designing a system where you minimize the interaction between cars and bikes, and especially with self-driving cars coming along, do these studies do any type of analysis like this?
That's a good question. I don't know that we've had any direct experience. We certainly had a lot of conversations recent months and years about the role of autonomous vehicles or the potential role of autonomous vehicles. In fact, we've had a autonomous vehicle pilot project running in our downtown, but it's not full autonomous. Obviously, it's got a driver, but to test some of the technology, and so that's kind of pushed this to the fore as we've got some regional players in that game. I think if you look at the stuff that and Heather and Maggie can probably speak to this as well. The studies that have been done. Yes, I think when you have barrier-separated bicycle lanes, you're just dramatically reducing the opportunity for conflict between those modes of transport, and so they tend to be safer. People tend to feel more comfortable taking their family and their children out on those. The autonomous vehicle question. I think it's going to be probably a little longer timeline than most people are saying before a lot of those key issues get resolved. But I would imagine that from the comfort level and the perception, especially from the pedestrian or the cyclist, some of that same data around kind of what types of barriers and delineations between the different modes provide the most comfort and the most safety. They're probably going to bear out some of the same solutions. That was my non-answer.
I think that was a pretty good answer.
Thank you.
All right. So, well, thank you, Anthony. We really appreciate you taking the time to be on this webinar to share your experiences with Complete Streets. So I think it's valuable when people can hear directly from someone who has had direct experience with it. So thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I appreciate it. So, all right. So for those of you who are able to stick around, Heather and I are going to go over the details of what is in a Complete Streets policy. So there are 10 elements that are recommended in the National Complete Streets Coalition, which you've heard us mention a few times. These guidelines come from them, and you can visit their website to kind of dig it more into detail on their recommendations. And actually, every year they rank the best policies of the year, and there have been a few in Illinois that have been in the top 10 ranking over the last decade. So here is really a quick list of the 10 elements. So we'll be going over each of these more in depth, and I'll hand it over to Heather to get started. Oh, sorry. One second. And so for each of these elements, we'll define what the element is, and then we'll show you an example from the model policy that we have that you can use that puts it into the context of a policy. So now I'll hand it over to Heather.
Okay, so as Maggie mentioned, the National Complete Streets Coalition recommends that every Complete Streets policy include 10 elements within them. So we'll go through each of the 10 and sort of explain what the purpose of the element it is, and then give you an example of the policy language we've developed that you're welcome to use and adapt for your purposes. So the first thing, and sort of the easier thing I think for most communities to articulate, is developing a vision and an intent for your policy. Just generally, we recommend, and the National Complete Streets Coalition recommends, that policies should include must, shall, or will language rather than intends to or might consider doing these things. So within your policy, include musts or shalls or wills just to make it a stronger, more implementable document with more teeth. So beyond that, within your vision, you should mention having a complete and connected network, list the benefits of complete streets to your community, specific things like which parties are you doing this for, which people, will it benefit economic development or the environment, how does this relate to your other goals, policies, and objectives for your community. Your vision should also reference equitable access. So thinking about who needs the most access to complete streets facilities in your community, who has the least connectivity, who has the most need for ensuring that they have sidewalks, bike lanes, crosswalks, safe crossings, whatever you're thinking. And your policy should also define multiple modes of transportation. Again, this is a policy to consider all modes of transportation that are being used in your community, so to define those here in your vision and intent. So these could include everybody from people walking, riding bikes, emergency services, equestrians, if you have them in your community, the list goes on. So here is some example language. I won't read this all, but you'll have it on your screen, and I think you'll also have the slides after this presentation. But you can see here we use the municipality will develop a policy that serves all residents, especially those who are most vulnerable. It lists out those vulnerable populations, including pedestrians, bicyclists, seniors, low-income people, and immigrant populations. And it also calls out walking, biking, and public transportation. So again, this is sort of one example of a vision and intent that could be used. But we also do encourage you to look at other example policies and see if there's things that resonate more with you that you're welcome to borrow.
All right, so the second element is a section about diverse users, so highlighting different populations, special populations in your community, and the example language. So again, it's about prioritizing underserved populations and listing out who are those people in your community. So in this example, we've listed people of color, people with disabilities, seniors, youth, households who don't have access to a car or a vehicle, households where English is not the first language or spoken less than very well. So calling out those populations is the main component of this element.
Okay, so then the next element is where things start getting juicy. This one is focused on identifying what types of projects and what phases of your roadway delivery process are included in your policy. So we recommend, and so does the Complete Streets Coalition, that all projects consider complete streets. This includes reconstruction projects or resurfacing projects, or even sometimes maintenance projects where you might be street sweeping and also want to maintain the bike facility that's on that street. In this step or this element, you should also specify the need to continue to accommodate people who are walking and biking and using transit during construction projects. So, for example, we often see sidewalks are blocked off for a development project with nowhere for the people to go and really even no warning at the beginning of the block to let them know they need to cross. So just sort of thinking through how that is operationalized in your construction process to make sure that the modes that are on that street and are supposed to be served by that street continue to be regardless of what's happening on it. So in this example, again, you can see we have all projects will start with a complete streets approach. All phases of the project development process are considered. So, from start to finish, you're thinking about how do we make sure complete streets are incorporated into our project. And we also hear reference during construction projects, safe accommodations will be provided for everybody using that street.
All right, so element 4, this is about exceptions. So if you want a policy to actually work in the real world, it needs to be able to handle exceptions to the rule to accommodate all modes. And some common exceptions recommended by the National Complete Streets Coalition is one, there are certain streets where certain groups are prohibited. So, for example, on an interstate, perhaps people walking and biking shouldn't be on that street. And if there's a pedestrian mall, motor vehicles shouldn't be on that street. So those exceptions can be called out, saying that if the cost of a project is excessively disproportionate to the need and use, is another common exception. So like to suddenly say, oh, this project, it's a $50 million project for our community, that might be a little out of control. So that can be an exception, and the National Complete Streets Coalition recommends not to define what exactly excessive means, since different projects will require different funding. And then another common exception is if there is documented absence of need, and that is both current need and future need. And then this element also is where it's important to define who's involved in approving exceptions and how those exceptions are documented. So who signs off on the exception or the variance, where it's documented, how it's documented, and how the public is involved. So here is an example. And again, this kind of lists all of those exceptions that I just went over in policy formats, and also calls out that these exceptions are discussed, publicized, and commented during a specific meeting.
Okay, so the next element is jurisdiction. So many of you probably are aware that there are multiple jurisdictions that control roads within your municipality. So the streets aren't just local controlled, they're not just municipal controlled, but there's often state roads or county roads that run through it, or even places where your streets intersect with townships and unincorporated areas. So there's often a lot of coordination that has to happen. So in this element, the goal is to discuss how you're working with your policy to ensure that projects happening on your roads led by others consider complete streets. So our example here shows that all projects and facilities within the public right-of-way, whether they're publicly or privately funded, will adhere to the policy. And agencies that should be collaborated with include, in this case, this is an Illinois example, the Illinois Department of Transportation, County DOT, and the township. Here you could also mention private development, though that could occur elsewhere in your community or in your policy as well. Oh, I'm sorry, we have more. Our model policy is also recommending coordinating with external partners and agencies to get input on roadway projects. This list could be very specific to your community, but some of the more general departments we recommend are your health department. They're always great partners in ensuring streets are healthy and walkable and bikeable. You could also think about IDNR if they're within your jurisdiction, your transit agencies like PACE or Metra, park districts, school districts, local nonprofits, and even just any members of the public who have a stake in what you're trying to accomplish. The other part of this draft language we have is making sure there's interdepartmental coordination that happens within projects. So typically your engineering or public works will be heavily involved, but think about other folks that you might not normally remember to coordinate with, like the maintenance people and also emergency services.
All right, so the next element is design guidelines and flexibility. So this is so encouraging communities to adopt and use the best and latest design standards. And here's the example. So it's saying use the latest best practices, and it lists several. So some examples in this example policy, it lists AASHTO, American Association of State Highway and Transportation Officials, and they're actually coming out with some new guidelines in a year or two. A lot about walking and biking facilities. The American Planning Association has design ideas, so does the Federal Highway Administration. The Institute of Transportation Engineers, specifically, they're designing walkable urban thoroughfares guide. And then NACTO, the National Association of City and Transportation Officials, has a lot of really great best practices and design ideas. The Active Transportation Alliance, we also have a document that some policies have referenced. And the list goes on, but making sure that your community is referencing those guidelines is always a good idea.
Okay, so the next element is land use and context. So we talked about this a little bit in the myth busting slides, but you want to make sure your policy specifies a few things. One, that new or revised plans and policies will how they will interact with this complete streets policy. So if you're developing a comprehensive plan, make sure this policy your complete streets policy is referenced. Same with active transportation plans, or even corridor plans, or larger scale development plans that are happening. Your policy should also consider the community context. So again, you want to make sure that projects that are happening within your confines are consistent with your community surroundings and the location-specific surroundings. And then finally, your policy should mention any unintended consequences that could happen as a result of complete streets development, such as displacement. This, I'm sure you've heard, has played out a lot in the city of Chicago in recent years, especially regarding the 606 development. So it's something to consider and make sure you're thinking about when you're working on any project, to make sure you're not displacing residents or having other negative impacts on them through a project. So here you can see some of the language. Again, we talk about incorporating and referencing a complete streets policy for new or revised plans and policies, being sensitive to the surrounding area, and the unintended consequences.
And then the eighth element is about performance measures. So this is what Anthony was speaking about, of looking at specific measures and tracking them over time. So it's collecting data and reporting back on that data, and setting a time frame for when that data collection actually occurs, and how it is shared, and who's responsible for doing this. And it can help make sure you're on the right track and allow you to make adjustments along the way. So in this example language, Uh, so it could be your public works director is responsible for reporting annually at a public forum the selected performance measures. So some example performance measures could be the number of miles of bikeway facilities installed. It could be the number of bike racks. It could be the feet of sidewalk, the number of curb ramps. And then you could be looking at the counts of people actually walking and biking, whether that's on a trail or to school. And then looking at safety as well, so looking at crash statistics and also looking at how is the community engaged throughout a project, the process of a project being developed. So next is element 9.
Okay, so element 9 is focused on project selection criteria. So this is thinking through your capital improvement program and how will complete streets be operationalized into that, and also specifying how equity will be addressed as you're selecting projects. So this goal is starting to get into the implementation side of things, and how do you think about funding, making sure projects are being considered as complete streets projects in every case in the future. So in this example, we're calling out safety as being an important, the highest priority, especially pedestrian safety for projects. So the pedestrian safety elements should be considered and given priority when looking through your list of capital projects that need to happen in the next year or few years. It also is calling out street design elements that support walking and biking that are context sensitive. And it's also saying that not all modes of transportation can receive the same degree of accommodations on every street. But you should be thinking about how to safely and comfortably accommodate people within the scope of that project. Moving on, this also references the municipality's budgeting process, making sure that it advances complete streets, references the performance measures from the previous element, and prioritizes access in the areas that are most in need that you probably identified in step 1 of your policy.
And then the final element is implementation. So so really the policy is the first step towards actually creating complete streets on your roads. And there are a few different implementation steps that the National Complete Streets Coalition recommends, but definitely look at other policies to see examples of what other communities have done. But one thing is, as Heather mentioned, making sure you revise related plans and policies to include complete streets as a consideration. It is in this step you can include offering trainings to staff repeatedly, especially because new people come on board, and making sure they're aware of the policy and know what it means and how to implement it. And then it is in this element, it's about creating some type of committee that is responsible for overseeing implementation of the policy, and then finally putting together a community engagement plan. And it can also be collecting in this implementation, can discuss collecting those performance measures that we implemented. So here's the example language. So again, it says convene a committee of internal and external decision makers. And then their task will be to figure out a plan for implementation of the policy and addressing several of those steps that I just mentioned. So that is it for the 10 elements. So we're almost finished here, but we just wanted to make sure you're aware of these 4 resources, which have a lot of great information about complete streets. So the National Complete Streets Coalition is at smartgrowthamerica.org. and they are ranking the best policies from the US. They have these ratings, they have the map, and they have a lot of resources on how you can actually develop a policy. CMAP, so Chicago's MPO, they have a complete streets toolkit, so anyone can use that. atpolicy.org, that's the Active Transportation Alliance, our site where we have several model policies from the Chicagoland region, a design manual, so you can feel free to look at those resources, use them, and make any adjustments as you see fit. And then we also have on our website, activetrans.org/Complete Streets Coalition, we have the model policy that we've been referencing, as well as other resources related to complete streets. And so please feel free to visit any of those websites for more information. And here is my contact and Heather's contact. So if you have any further questions, and thank you for those of you who lasted this long. And yeah, if anyone has any questions, we can quickly answer those. I see someone's typing. Yes. Oh, and Jeff has something. Oh, okay, let's see. The question is, so we've got an easy and a hard question. It says, the first is easy. Do complete streets ordinances ever set standards for road quality maintenance? So in other words, require streets stay above a certain quality deterioration rating.
I haven't seen an example of that, but if that is a goal of yours, you could definitely do it through a complete streets policy. But no, I can't think of an example where that has been included in a policy.
And then we've got another question about the guidelines, the design guides that we were mentioning, and yes, we can email those out as well. And then we have a long question here. So it says, in Wilmette, we have a complete streets ordinance. It even uses plenty of shalls. However, it's weakened throughout with qualifiers like when practical, should consider, and will encourage. When the village applied for a $3.5 million federal grant for a certain road's reconstruction, they repeatedly said, per our complete streets policy, that bike lanes would be part of the construction. The village board then decided to include no bike accommodations after neighbors complained. Your list of guidelines largely answered this, but do you have any other advice about how to strengthen a policy such that it results in real infrastructure changes in the face of leaders who don't want to invest in complete streets? Are there really municipalities that truly require accommodations for biking and pedestrians during all types of road maintenance?
I mean, I think that there are many municipalities that are trying to truly accommodate all users during all types of road projects. But you do also have to take into account the requirements of federal processes for bigger reconstruction projects. So if a project is funded through IDOT by a federal grant, there is a specific public engagement process that has to be conducted in order to comply with grant funding requirements. And during those projects, a large component is having a public engagement process with abutters of the project being brought in and consulted and asked for their opinions. And that's often where if the abutters say no to it, a community may have to say, okay, we can't put this facility in as a result. And I don't think it would be difficult, I think, for the policy to change that. And so it's our role as advocates to work with our friends and neighbors and everyone in our community to get them bought into the idea of having complete streets and making it a priority for a community. I don't know if you want to add anything to that effect.
Yeah, I think it is about municipal staff and elected officials hearing more positive feelings from community members about walking and biking projects rather than all the negative ones. And unfortunately, like when a project happens, it is like those who are, bothered by the project are the ones that are very vocal, and those who would be very happy to see the project, they often don't voice their approval or excitement about the project. And so, as Heather mentioned, it's all of our responsibility to make sure we are sending positive feedback to our villages and cities, and then trying to work with our friends, our neighbors, our family, and encouraging them to do the same. And if maybe they don't see things the same way, listening to them and maybe bringing them on a nice walk or a bike ride, and they're little steps. But yes, that's a challenge when a community hears a lot of negative feedback. They're in a bit of a conundrum sometimes. So let's see. We have another question. Let's see. By any chance, do you have any statistics about whether having sidewalks increases crime in a neighborhood? This has been one major question and reason why more neighbors aren't supportive. Interesting. I have not seen any statistics about sidewalks causing more crime. I have heard at public meetings from police officers that have spoken about different projects that it's the roads that are really the avenues towards crime. A vehicle is an easier way to access a space, I guess, where you want to commit crime and leave really quickly. So sidewalks, I would say roads are more of a problem than sidewalks, and but everyone has a road in front of their home, or most everyone. So, but Heather, I don't know if you have anything to add about.
No, I mean, I hear the same from Maggie, that people often do have those concerns, but I've never seen a study confirming that, and I imagine that's because it's not true. We could do a little research and see if we can find anything. I mean, I know there's a lot of studies done on all the benefits of having a sidewalk, like the public health benefits. People are healthier in communities with sidewalks, for example. So even if there's no data that we can provide that says this isn't true, we can give you more data about like all these great benefits that are provided by sidewalks, if nothing else.
Yeah. And maybe it's like looking at communities who do have a rather large, robust sidewalk network, and looking at, okay, a lot of these communities are perfectly safe, like their crime is very low. As examples of sidewalks do not necessarily correlate to increased crime.
Yeah, that's a good point. You could, well, no, never. I had an idea that isn't true, so never mind.
And Jeff, you just sent a link about natural surveillance, and maybe perhaps this is related to just having eyes on the street. More people walking around is a good thing for crime, and or for lowering crime. And there have been some studies about trails that have shown that when there are trails in communities, there is no increase in crime. Basically, things stay the same. Rails to Trails did some studies on that. All right, so I think we will close this out. So thank you all for joining, and again, feel free to reach out to us if you have any other questions about complete streets. And we'll be doing another webinar in February, and we'll be actually focused on funding and grant writing tips. So stay tuned for more information about that, and we'll talk to you later.